The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 801 9 Years. Lex was not even remotely tempted by Bacterius' offer. As if the man himself was not suspicious enough, he was refusing to properly explain what the invitation was or who it was from. He also did not explain its purpose properly, and seemed more focused on teasing Lex. Perhaps inviting Lex was just an excuse, and in reality he hoped that Lex would not attend. Something like this could be a shady way of ensuring the success of someone who would consider Lex a threat. Of course, this was just a random guess Lex had, and was one of endless possibilities. I don't need to test my pride, nor validate my worth. Thank you for the invitation, but if that is all, I am not interested. Maybe if Bacterius had gone about it a different way, Lex would at least be curious about the tournament. After all, Bacterius himself had proved himself to be quite powerful, and yet he was only in charge of extending invitations. Clearly this matter was far from simple. Moreover, if the tournament really encompassed everyone across the Origin realm, then Lex could make a few guesses of his own over who the tournament was being held by. But in his current mood, he was not the least bit interested. Lightsville Bacterius, who had been grinning in confidence earlier, froze upon hearing Lex's refusal. He had been sure that would work. He even watched a few marketing videos that said he had to bait his clients into developing curiosity before he could get them. He planned this out thoroughly, but it was not going well. His smile faded a bit as he quickly thought of his next plan of action. Among all his peers, he had the lowest number of accepted invitations. If that did not charge, he would be humiliated. If you are not interested, that's fine, Bacterius said, feigning disinterest. He remembered the marketing video said he had to appear as if he did not need the client's business, but rather that his business was bringing benefits to the client. However, it won't hurt to know a little about the tournament either way. Afterwards, if you still remain uninterested, that is up to you. No one is forced to attend. Bacterius felt that his shift in strategy was extremely flawless, and that Lex would not notice at all. But Lex, who spent countless hours dealing with guests and talking with people of all ilk, immediately picked up when Bacterius changed his body language and actual language as well. He immediately made a judgment that Bacterius was someone with an incredibly high level of cultivation who had lived for a very long time, and thus was not used to speaking to people. He was more used to others sucking up to him and hanging on his every word, so that he never needed to make any effort at all. Some things you are genuinely not qualified to know, and are even better off remaining unaware of. But no doubt, you have heard of a few things. Have you ever heard of the war with the Fugan? You've surely heard of the Henali conventions. You probably feel like these things are too far away from you, and while that may be the case now, as long as your cultivation keeps rising, that won't always be the case. Well, this tournament is an opportunity to get a head start on these things, and secure the future of your cultivation by getting in contact with the peak of the Origin realm. The purpose of the tournament is to uncover the best of the best, and provide them with the support they need to properly flourish. You probably know how difficult it is to cultivate. For now, you can get by on the resources you accumulate on your own. But as your level grows, the resources you need will grow ever scarce. To accumulate them, you will need the power of an entire organization or sect. When you enter the immortal realm, growing will be even harder. Entire galaxies are unable to give birth to a single heavenly immortal all too often. That's not because those galaxies lack the necessary resources, but that they are too scattered and well hidden. It is almost impossible to regularly come across all your required resources on your own, let alone get your hands on incredible techniques and special items that can help you maintain the overwhelming strength you have in your current realm. After all, although you can surpass your realm now, there is no guarantee that in higher realms you won't become average. But through this tournament, if you can prove yourself, you will be given the best opportunities across the entire realm, let alone galaxy. Maybe someone of your skill has already been invited to Ventura. That is one path cultivators can take, but it is not the only path. Moreover, joining Ventura comes with its own restrictions, and is not suitable for everyone. This tournament, however, is an opportunity that comes with no strings attached. Of course, if you get selected, and become eligible for the next stages, then you can choose whether you want to continue or not. After all, at that point there will be a few conditions. But that comes later. Here, I'm leaving the entry token with you. The tournament will begin in 9 years. You can decide what to do by then. Without waiting for Lex to reject again, Bacterius disappeared, leaving behind what looked like a convention coupon. Lex did not know how to respond. It seemed teleporting away to end a conversation was not just a habit he had. He looked at the coupon and scanned it with his spirit sense, but discovered nothing extraordinary about it except that it had his name on it. After considering it briefly, he decided to put it in his spatial bangle. He would leave it at the inn for now. 9 years was a long time, who knew what the situation would be then? He closed his eyes and began meditating. He had to wait for the confirmation from Hicks, and for this planet to connect to the inn. He decided not to leave his room until everything was done, and he could leave this planet. There was already so much trouble, he did not want to attract more. Slowly the day turned to night, and nothing worth mentioning happened to Lex at least. On the border of the town, a pale elf was running as if his life depended on it. A few miles behind him, cloaked figures seemed to be searching for his tracks. Chapter 802 Boring when nothing happens. Lex spent the next few hours peacefully cultivating in his room, but discovered that it was much harder for him to lose his sense of time like before. Previously, Lex would get lost in the feeling of cultivating, especially since he could feel himself grow stronger. But now that he had tasted how it felt to cultivate atop a dragon, normal cultivation no longer enticed him as much. This was especially because his gains were measurably greater whilst atop the dragon. Eventually, his thoughts could not help but veer towards his family. His parents were a lot more formidable than he assumed. They did not just have the backing of a powerful family like the Williams family, but also had tremendous individual strength. If that was the case, he really could not imagine what reason there could be for them to keep him out of the loop. He sighed, then stopped thinking about such matters. To be entirely honest, he no longer even cared what their reasons were. He had completely moved on from it. There was, however, a single thought that occurred to him, one that he did not contemplate for long since there was no way of verifying it. On the entire planet Earth, it seemed that he was one of the most unique beings, if one did not count Bautet or Phallic. His connection to the origin realm and the cultivation world was much more complicated than even he ever realized. Given that, and the fact that there were about 8 billion humans, and countless billion other animals, the chances that he specifically would get the system by accident were too low. It was almost as if it were by design. After all, unless his family continued to ignore him until he died, it was destined that his life would be extremely eventful. Whatever the case, whether it was concerning the system or his family, he put it aside. These were matters he would consider in greater detail when he was stronger. As for his family, so he had family problems. What was the big deal? As a millennial, that came standard for him. He let his thoughts wander on other things for a while. Lex could easily deduce that the tournament he had been invited to was some watered-down, basic version of the upcoming Champions tourney. As the Innkeeper he already had an invitation, but knowing that he as Lex had one as well felt nice. He suddenly had the urge to compete between his two identities. As the Innkeeper he had many advantages, but as Lex he had very few connections or affiliations. He was more or less developing his Innkeeper identity regardless of whether he wanted to or not, but his own identity was really lagging behind. Originally he didn't care about it, for he did not have a complex about his identities. Whether he was called the Innkeeper, Leo, or Lex, all of them were him. Sure, he behaved differently when exhibiting each identity, but even that different behavior was a part of him. But the idea of competing seemed interesting. If that was the case, how should he compete? As far as fame went, both Lex and the Innkeeper identities had various levels of fame across the origin realm. Then it came to connections and influence. As the Innkeeper, he had all of the Midnight Inn at his disposal, and had connections to various Dao lords. As Lex, he had that connection to a mysterious man who was much stronger than anyone he had ever met, but that was not a connection he could really leverage. In that case, the best of his connections were a few Earth immortals down in the crystal realm. The main difference was that as the Innkeeper he would not need to do anything, and everyone would come and find him. As Lex, if he wanted to develop his connections and influence, he would need to be more proactive. Was this really something he should waste his time on? It wasn't as if he had only a few things on his plate. After considering it for a moment, he decided that he would not go out of his way to do anything, as he had his priorities set, but since he had the time and energy, he might as well make the most of it right now. He stood up, no longer content to cultivate without his dragon cultivation mat. It seemed he had been in the wrong for blaming his fate for always getting him into trouble. Now that no trouble had come his way, he was a little bored. He stepped out of his room and began to stroll the streets with his hands in his pockets. Although there were no streetlights, many of the plants around him gave off a gentle, bluish-green light that not only illuminated his path but gave the entire town an entirely different vibe from during the day. The streets were not empty, and seemed just as busy as they were during the day. The only difference was that everyone made sure not to make too much noise, staying as hushed as possible. Feeling like he had entered a storybook, Lex walked the streets and took an inspiration from all that he saw around him. At night, the inn was usually illuminated by the sea of floating lanterns in the sky, but it wasn't a bad idea to incorporate bioluminescent plants here and there. Of course he could not add them randomly, as he used to do back in his early days in the inn. Instead, he would find suitable locations where the lanterns don't shine. That way, at night, different areas of the inn would take on different shades. Lex smiled as he walked among the crowds. It seemed that he was most comfortable when he was around large crowds of people. Getting a system focused around having lots of guests really suited him. His casual, simple stroll slowly led him to the heart of the town, and then through it towards the outer boundary of the town on the other side. This entire time, he had been following the path outlined by his instincts. Something interesting was waiting for him this way. A few minutes later, once Lex had left the proper path and ventured into the grassy wilderness, he discovered an elf laying flat on the ground, panting and heaving as if he had run the longest marathon of his life. The moment the elf saw Lex, surprise and fear flashed in his eyes, and he froze. He seemed to have given up on life, and was waiting for an inevitable horror to descend onto him. "I guess I shouldn't be asking if you're alright," said Lex as he squatted down and summoned a bottle of recovery pills from his spatial bangle. The pills not only sped up the recovery of spiritual energy within the body, they also helped eliminate some physical fatigue. They were very generic pills, although he had them in the best possible quality available, and were some of the many items he took with him on his excursions now. He had come a long way from only carrying a few gold coins and a couple of weapons whenever he visited a new planet. "These will help you regain some of your stamina," Lex said as he held out the bottle. "I'm not sure who you're hiding from, but I assure you, I have nothing to do with them." "Wait, you don't recognize me?" asked the elf, his voice filled with equal amounts of incredulity and a sense of being offended. "Should I recognize you? If you're someone famous on this planet, I only arrived a short while ago, so I haven't really had the time to get acquainted with the local culture." As Lex spoke, he looked out towards the horizon for any sign of the elf's pursuers, but there was no indication of them for now. "Is someone trying to harm you?" "I was under the impression that this was a very safe planet," he commented. Powell had told him that there was a formation covering the entire planet and that the Tyleans took security very strongly. "Harm me? That's the understatement of the century," said the elf despondently as he swallowed one of the pills and handed Lex the bottle back. "That old geezer is trying to get me married. A single interplanetary incident with the Princess of Astoria, and now I have to take responsibility." "What, take responsibility?" "All I did was flirt with her a little bit and use her authority to enter the field of sacred grains." The elf was grumbling, but then suddenly realized that all his energy was entirely recovered. A moment ago he had been completely spent, yet now he was as fit as a fiddle. "What kind of pills did you give me? Even I've never had something like that." So you're someone famous on this planet, and you're getting married, Lex mused, ignoring his question. He had too many of such pills he had taken from the Emporium, so he never really considered them too valuable. Based on my luck, I'm guessing, you must be the heir of this place, right? Chapter 803 Tragic Life of an Heir. Yes, how did you know? Asked the pale elf. He stood up and took a good look at Lex, but with his entire body covered, there naturally wasn't much to see. To hide his current situation, he had his entire body covered from head to toe. Oh, you're from one of those races. My apologies, I didn't mean to stare, the elf quickly said as he looked away from Lex. One of what races? I think you may be misunderstanding something. As for how I could tell you were the heir, it was simple enough. There's no need to consider you talking about princesses or anything else. Just based on my luck, I wouldn't encounter an ordinary situation. You're quite confident in your luck, the elf replied, not realizing what Lex had meant. Quite. Speaking of my luck, do you want to leave this area? If you're being pursued, then your pursuers might stumble right onto us if we don't leave. Yes, that's a great idea. And I know just where to go, the elf said before beginning to hastily march towards town. Will you be coming as well? I'd like to repay you for the pill. Why not? Lex said as he joined the elf. I'd like to hear the story of the heir being forced into a marriage. So far, I've only encountered happy couples, so this will be somewhat of a change. By the way, how did you get out of the princess situation? I thought Talea was supposed to be a neutral entity. It is, the elf said with a look of regret on his face. The old geezer in charge directly told the princess's family that he would accept any punishment I receive without any interference since I started the situation to begin with. He likes looking high and mighty, but I know he was just getting back at me. The old geezer has kept me on neutral territory my whole life, so he wasn't exactly pleased that I left to begin with. What was your punishment? Is that princess your bride-to-be? No, nothing like that. I had to give up all my gains from the field of sacred harvest, and pay a little more on top. It's quite sad, I have to say. The field is, predictably, filled with the absolute best harvest in the galaxy. A single crop or fruit from there just tastes absolutely divine. I mean, yes, it's good for you and packed with all kinds of medical benefits, but let's be real here. It's the absolute divine taste that has everyone hooked. Lex did not comment, and simply silently wondered if the prince was someone special. Was that why he had been locked on his own territory his whole life? But once I got back, the geezer decided I was too wild and irresponsible. In his words, I was not taking my role as heir seriously at all, and that I needed a wife to tame me. The heir scoffed at that, and looked absolutely disgusted. It seems to me that you're not quite happy with your position as heir, so why don't you give it up? That way you'll be able to do whatever you want. Lex was only speaking randomly, but little did he expect that the heir resonated with his words tremendously. Exactly. I think so too. Since I've been young, I've tried to get out of it. Sure, it brings with it a lot of power and authority, but neither of those things are edible. They also come with a lot of baggage. Frankly, I'm not interested. Although their conversation seemed casual, the two of them were moving quite quickly now that the heir had recovered somewhat. Instead of continuing deeper into the wilderness, where no one may notice him, they actually went directly into town. A few passerbyers already noticed the heir, and were struck with confusion since they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Lights of Lex did not comment on the situation, and just followed the heir, as he seemed to know exactly where he was going. But the way we do things here is a little different. Are you familiar with Darmin? He asked. Darmin was the name of the neutral organization which ran Talea. Besides the fact that they run Talea, not at all. I only came to this planet because I was interested in the potential for trade it presented. I guessed as much. It's quite simple. Darmin owns 4 star systems, and we have about 21 habitable planets within that space. The territory is quite small, but we are able to maintain our neutral stance even so. In fact, we even accept dealing with pirates and all kinds of outlaws, and do so, quite openly. Such actions not only begin retaliation from the forces in which those outlaws are wanted, but often we are targeted by those very same outlaws as well. All in all, there's a lot of pressure. We would not be able to cope with it and maintain our situation if we were weak. But at the same time, being strong also presents a conundrum, for why would the strong limit their own expansion? After all, everyone knows that the stronger one is, the more resources they require. Now, thoroughly within the center of the town, the heir led Lex to a very inconspicuous little restaurant. There were only 4 small tables and a counter where guests could sit, and at this hour the entire place was deserted. The restaurant remained open nonetheless, and their heir sat down on the counter, ignoring the state of the place. 3 bowls of the spicy bowl, please, the heir yelled in the back, prompting the sound of dishes falling down somewhere in the kitchen. Clearly his yell had startled someone, but the heir simply continued his story. The reason why we are strong, yet choose to remain neutral and not expand, is because we already have everything we need to grow incredibly strong, and more. Chapter 804 Old Geezer. The heir sighed, as if lamenting the abundant availability of endless resources, practically paving the cultivation path for himself. What a burden it must be to be rich. You'll excuse me if I don't go into the details, the heir said casually, as if it was already understood. But the point is that, ultimately, what Darmin values is a specific kind of talent. Unfortunately, I have talent pouring out of my every pore, so from the day I was born, I was destined to be heir. Did you know, I'm not even related to any of the previous rulers? My parents ran a small clinic in the capital. When I was born, and my talents detected, the royal family adopted me outright. My parents received 13 billion supreme spirit stones, as well as noble titles, property, as well as the ownership of one of Telea's 13 moons. Suffice to say, after that, my parents became extremely busy trying to give me as many siblings as possible. Unfortunately, none of them have even a speck of talent compared to mine. The heir sounded both proud and mad at that statement. So who are you supposed to be marrying then, if not the princess? My name is Lex, by the way. Since he was building connections, there was no point in hiding his identity, though he seriously doubted anyone would connect him in his current state to Lex William, Dragon Tamer. Oh, yes, introductions. Nice to meet you, Lex, my name is Kentaharu. Sorry, I'm not used to introducing myself, I forgot it was something one has to do. As for my fiancée, I am not sure of her identity yet. She has been selected for me. No doubt, she will also be tremendously talented, though not as much as me, or she would be the heir. Moreover, she will no doubt have a steady and stable personality, to keep me in check in the future. Kenta sounded absolutely disgusted at his own words. From behind the counter, the kitchen door opened and another elf walked out, holding a tray carrying 3 steaming bowls. Lex was already mentally prepared to face some extremely unusual alien food, but was genuinely surprised to find that he had been served ramen. It seemed that it was not so unusual that the elves also cooked ramen. After all, in their long lives, they had probably experimented with various kinds of foods. The elf tapped the wooden counter twice, and 3 pairs of chopsticks grew right out of the wood. Treating it as completely normal, the heir grabbed the chopsticks and began eating. So what's your plan? Do you think you can actually run away from the wedding? Oh, absolutely not, Kenta replied casually. The entirety of Telea is being monitored, not to mention the fact that all teleportation formations have been disabled to prevent me from escaping. No, I'll probably be ignored until I'm needed. But you know, as a man, I must at least show some form of protest. How can I just accept without expressing my dissatisfaction? I need to run away at least a couple more times during the wedding itself. If you don't expect to actually escape, why did you run till you actually collapsed? Lex asked, looking at their heir strangely. Well, even though the royal family knows I cannot actually escape, they also have to go through the motions and try and prevent me. To get away, I actually had to erase a formation that had been conjured right on my very skin. I had to actually excrete all the spiritual energy within my body to cause the formation to fail. I bet they never saw that one coming. So this is all just a game? How anticlimactic. And here I thought that I was going to help you escape from a wedding. Ha ha ha, no, to actually do that is impossible. This guy won't let me. Kenta pointed at the empty seat beside him, and Lex looked there, but saw no one. The seat was empty. He was just about to say so when he noticed that the third bowl, which had been placed in front of the seat, was empty. His pupils constricted and he looked back at the seat, and this time saw a rather aged-looking elf who winked at Lex. The elf had long, braided gray hair that reached the floor, and a short but well-groomed gray beard. Please, go ahead. I'm quite curious to see how you can help my adopted son here escape his wedding. The man had no aura at all whatsoever, and appeared entirely forgettable, despite the fact that it wasn't common for elves to have beards. Were you with us the entire time? Lex asked, having quickly recovered from the surprise earlier. At this point, he was all too used to very strong cultivators acting mysteriously. He was even looking forward to the day he could do the same. Not really, but there's no place on this planet, or even this entire star system where my spirit sense cannot reach. Lex, meet my adopted father, or as I like to call him, Old Geezer. Don't mention his age. Don't ask his age. When I was young and did something bad, he would punish me by making me count all the way to his age, without skipping a single number. I've spent a few good years doing nothing except counting if you add up all the time I've spent, so I don't like to think about it. It's a pleasure to meet you, said Lex as he began to eat his ramen as well. Both Kenta and his father were surprised by how quickly Lex adapted to the situation, but did not comment on it. By the way, you shouldn't challenge me. I really can help him escape his wedding, even if you watch the entire process with your spirit sense. At this point, both Kenta and his father looked at Lex with curiosity. Are you sure, Lex? Don't let the geezer fool you, he's a genuine celestial immortal. Chapter 805 A Bet. Lex took in Kenta's words easily, as by now he was all too used to bumping into extremely strong cultivators. But while he was not surprised to hear the knowledge, encountering powerful cultivators outside the inn was very dangerous. Not only did he have to maintain proper decorum to ensure he did not offend the other in any way, but he had to utilize this opportunity to the best of his abilities, and expand his network. The greatest advantage he had in the current situation was that as someone from a neutral organization, the chances of being killed or harmed were extremely low. The categorization of a neutral organization was extremely difficult to attain, as this was one given through the Henali portal and not assumed by oneself. As long as Lex did not break any laws, he did not have to fear randomly being targeted. But at the same time, he had to act as if his meeting with Hicks had been exposed. Theoretically, there was no reason for a celestial immortal to be spying on him at that time. That was most likely even true. However, there was no guarantee that he could not detect clues on or around Lex. Essentially, besides the system, Lex had to assume that all of his secrets were laid bare in front of the immortal. After all, the gap between them was too big. Lex could not even begin to imagine the power the elf in front of him wielded. Fortunately, the reason Powell had sent him here to begin with was that even if Lex were to be discovered contacting Hicks, there should be no issue. After all, as a planet of a true neutral organization, Talea was often the ground for such clandestine meetings. My apologies for not acknowledging you sooner, Senior, Lex said, though it was clear from his voice that he lacked the usual reverence and fear that was associated with meeting a powerful cultivator. Not at all. In fact, I would be surprised if you had acknowledged me earlier. I admit, I am curious, however, about how you can help this brat escape from under my nose. It is not difficult, because it's not my power that I would be using to do it, Lex said, before slowly lowering his mask. He had removed half of it to reveal his mouth so that he could eat, but that had revealed the gruesome state of his body. Now that he was done eating, he naturally would not continue to put himself on display, especially with a celestial immortal nearby. But, even though I can do it, that does not mean I actually will. Interfering in local political matters is no doubt illegal, and I still have work here that needs to be done. I don't want to be arrested. Besides, what would you even do if you managed to escape? Do you even know how to live life without the status of an heir? PFT, if it were some noble pursuit, I would at least be impressed. But no, what this no-good son of mine wants to do is open up a small restaurant somewhere and create new cuisines. Truly a waste. What do you know about noble pursuits? I am a common elf with humble roots. Doing mundane tasks is in my blood. Creating delicious food is my divine duty, and even the status of heir will not prevent me from following this path. All right, said Kenta's father, muting him with a wave of his finger. It seemed like he had heard this speech too many times. This elf truly did not exude the usual dignity and arrogance of a peak cultivator. Or perhaps, because of his strength, he did not need to pretend to be anything other than himself. You're quite interesting, Lex. I sense quite a few auras on you. Let's see, there's that human, Jotun. The elf said his name with derision, as if he did not like Jotun at all. But while there was derision, Lex could not sense disdain of him being weak. That either meant that Jotun was not exactly weak, or that Lex was reading too much into the situation. There's also some inscriptions in your body. That's interesting. The inscriptions are using your body as talisman paper. Quite ingenious, but not good for you in the long run. Let's see, there's also, Senior Zuriadissa. Instinctively, the elf straightened his back as he said the name, as if even mentioning her required the appropriate decorum. You also have the aura of a dragon on you, the aura of a primordial seed, the aura of, my goodness, look at me. I could not control myself at all. I did not mean to pry, I was just wondering whose strength you could possibly use to take the brat away. But even with everything I've seen, I cannot find an answer. Now, I truly am curious. I'll leave you with an invitation to the brat's wedding. There will be a lot of ceremonies, but in essence, the main wedding ceremony will be in 5 days. If you can take this brat away before that happens, not only will I not charge you with any crime, but I will help you remove one of the inscriptions in your body. Whoever placed them there was very skilled, but clearly, they did not account for your cultivation technique. It's interfering with your growth. You should really find a way to get rid of them all before you become an immortal. Kenta, who had been muted this entire time, was extremely surprised when he heard his old man speak. He tried to comment in the middle, but his words wouldn't come out. Lex was also surprised, not by anything else, but from the fact that the immortal offered to help him voluntarily. That was not something he expected from someone who was supposed to be neutral. If he had to guess, it may be a way of him apologizing for investigating Lex. Whatever the case, if he could get rid of the inscriptions, it was truly worth it. Are you sure it won't cause any problems? Isn't the heir important to you? Ho, look at that confidence. You are quite certain that you'll be able to take him away from me. In that case, do not worry. Even if he is gone, Darmin will not suffer. In that case, I'll see you in 5 days. The immortal smiled, before he and the heir disappeared from their seats, slowly fading away. Old geezer, that's not like you, said Kenta, who reappeared with his father inside a large mansion. I made a mistake. I thought he was a junior, but how was I supposed to know that he would have such a deep background? Since I saw that which I should not have seen, I need to repay him lest I become infected by his karma. Giving him this opportunity is my repayment. What did you see? Kenta asked, curiously. The heir's father did not answer, but an image flashed in his mind. The last aura he sensed, before he awoke from his stupor and stopped, was the aura of the accursed Cthulhu clan. He had flashbacks of the damned war they fought, and how devastating their powers were. He thought that clan had perished, so why was there someone who wore their aura still around? He did not know, nor did he want to find out. The Origin realm was really not peaceful these days, it was best to stay away from trouble. You should prepare. Your first public appearance is in a few hours. Kenta grumbled, but walked away anyway. There was no point in arguing. He did not really expect to be rescued by Lex, so he needed to maintain the best possible relationship with the old G's. Moreover, even if he really escaped, could he really stay away indefinitely? He turned back and looked at his adopted father. No, it was absolutely impossible. When he had to choose between freedom and possibly becoming a celestial immortal, he would choose the latter every time. Back at the restaurant, Lex looked at the angry waiter with confusion. "What's wrong?" he asked, concerned. "What do you mean what's wrong? This is a restaurant, not a charity. If you eat, you have to pay. 3 spicy bowls, so that's 3 Thailand credits. If you can't pay, I'm reporting you to the police." Did the heir as well as the literal immortal just dine and dash? Damn, they could at least have warned him so he could have dashed as well. On second thought, he could not break any of the laws here, apparently the whole planet was being monitored. "No, it's just a misunderstanding." "I'll pay right away," said Lex weakly as he transferred the credits. Now that he had stirred up a little trouble, his heart was finally at peace and he could rest. Maybe he'd even go back and take a nap, he couldn't remember the last time he did that. Chapter 806 Another cultivation session. Lex thought that he would barely nap for half an hour, or that if he entered deep sleep he'd be out for a couple of hours at most. He couldn't be blamed for thinking as such, because lately he would sleep very less unless he was injured and using his recovery techniques. Even though, right now, he was technically injured, he did not plan on using any recovery techniques, so he planned on only passing a few hours at most. Unfortunately, due to the fact that none of his pain receptors were working, and his incredible physique allowed him to function normally, he underestimated how injured he really was. That was not to mention that any time he was injured, his spirit was injured as well, which really affected his decision-making skills. It was the most significant flaw of his cultivation technique. Though to be fair, Regal Embrace was on the path to ensure that he never got hurt in the first place. Now though, the end result would be up to his own efforts. He fell asleep the moment he hit the bed, and entered a deep dreamless sleep. He did not move or flinch, or even let out a single sound besides his soft breathing, until he was roused from sleep by the sound of a system notification. Lex woke up a little disoriented, wondering who he was and what was going on. A couple of moments later he remembered everything, and realized that he may have overslept. "Mary, how long was I sleeping?" he asked as he stifled a yawn, and pushed himself up. The bones in his back gave out a satisfying crack as he stretched. "A little over 30 hours, she said, sounding distracted. 30 hours, he repeated, startled. He checked to see what notification he had received and saw that the planet had already been connected to the inn, and he could head back at any time that he wanted. But, fortunately, not too much time had passed and the notification had come very timely. If he missed the wedding ceremony, he would not suffer any harm, but he would lose an opportunity that was not easy to come by. So far, only celestial immortals had been able to sense the inscriptions in his body, and it was not easy to meet them, let alone get their help. Speaking of which, he had guessed earlier that Jotun was also a celestial immortal, and that fact had more or less been confirmed by the heir's father. Jotun having such a cultivation was something Lex could understand and accept, since he was the emperor of a massive empire and worked for the Henali directly. But this small neutral organization, Darmin, which barely had a few star systems, was also led by a celestial immortal? Did that mean that, in essence, Darmin was just as powerful as the Empire? At least in terms of the power of their upper echelon. But one spanned galaxies, and the other did not even cover 1% of a single galaxy. How was that possible? Ultimately, he could not come up with an answer, and chalked it up to the personal preference of the celestial immortals. But whatever opportunity that Kenta had been talking about that required his special talent must be extraordinary if it was enough to keep a celestial satisfied. The outline of a plan formed in Lex's mind as he checked the card that the Hicks assassin had left him. A small, gray circle had formed on it, indicating that the task had been accepted by Hicks. Fortunately, he did not oversleep, or he would miss the deadline to pay the assassin organization. He channeled his spirit energy inside and received the details of the required payment. Since Barley's cultivation level was low, the task was originally not expensive. However, since his location was unknown, to the extent that not even the star system could be determined, the price shot up drastically. It was sufficient to say that the price of this commission was completely not worth it for an ordinary person. However, Lex was not ordinary, and the price meant nothing to him. Not only was his museum of wealth filled with countless treasures and spirit stones, but soon he would receive the first payment from those refugees from Earth who had leased out a minor realm. Their payments would be in terms of resources mined and collected from that realm instead of MP, so at this point it could even be said that the cost to hunt down someone through an entire galaxy cost but a paltry sum for him. He channeled more spirit energy into the card, causing it to turn to ash once again and form the reality filter, once again painting a portion of his room black and white. He placed a small spatial ring filled with 1 billion spirit stones, 130 vials of spirit liquid and 10 tons of a version of gold, called red vein gold. All of these came from his loot from the dragon horde, and didn't even cover 1% of what he looted, let alone what was in the horde itself. At that thought, Lex could not help but lick his lips. Robbing dragons was a very lucrative business. "Hey pal, you don't happen to remember any old or dying dragons, do you?" he asked. "I know many old dragons, but none who are dying," the wooden ring answered dutifully. Lex shook his head. He hadn't asked the question seriously. He was not crazy enough to go face a living dragon right now. Maybe when he reached the peak of the nascent realm he could consider it. The filter vanished, alongside the payment, and the card reformed. Satisfied, Lex put the card in his spatial bangle and disappeared back to the inn. He spent a couple of hours handling various tasks at the inn. Recently, the population of the aquatic beasts inside the inn was booming, and he needed to expand his rivers and lakes to ensure there was enough space for them. In fact, he decided to make a supermassive lake far away from the main attractions where they could live for now. Once all urgent tasks were taken care of, Lex grabbed a device connected to the Henali portal and teleported back to his restroom. By now, unfortunately, Lex had learned to tolerate the unique cultivation conditions absorbing items with laws required. He planned on using his next cultivation session to do some research on Kenta's wedding and come up with a proper plan. Even though all it would take was to hand him a key to the inn and crush it, Lex did not know how easy or hard the Celestial was going to make it for him. He planned on treating it like an infiltration mission, allowing him to once again act like a spy. Not delaying the matter further, Lex bit the blade of grass given to him by Zuri, and began his cultivation session. A couple of hours later, once Lex had gotten used to it, he began perusing the Henali portal. He looked up royal weddings in Talea, and what customs they usually entailed. He looked into what Kenta's wedding would entail, and discovered something unusual. No one knew who the bride was yet. There was endless speculation on why the identity of the bride was hidden, but the most popular conspiracy seemed to be that she had a troublesome identity, which matched the habits of the similarly frivolous heir. Lex did not believe it, nor did he care so much about it. What truly caught his attention was that there was no real mention or detailed explanation of the inner workings of Darmin, just a brief mention that each star system was controlled by a different family. At the same time, it was mentioned that Kenta was only the heir to Talea, not Darmin. Moreover, his adopted father was only in charge of the star system with Talea in it. How was it possible that a Celestial was not in charge of the entire organization, but just a single star system? The only way that made sense was if there were more Celestials in other star systems. But, how was that even possible? Celestials did not grow on trees, they were not so easy to come across. Lex raised his guard somewhat as the ambiguity of the situation concerned him somewhat. It also strengthened his motivation to build a connection with Kenta, and be in Darmin's good books. He did not expect any significant help from a neutral organization, but sometimes having a relationship was help enough. 12 hours later, a weak Lex crawled out of the bathroom. He began to seriously doubt the prophecy he had received. Maybe what Leslie had foreseen was not regret that could only be avoided using a blade. Maybe what she saw was him regretting the decision to use it. When he remembered that he had 90% more of the blade still left, Lex lost the strength in his arms to hold himself up and collapsed. Chapter 807 Infiltration. A few days later, Lex found himself sitting in the fastest, non-teleportation, public transport on Talea. For all intents and purposes, it could be considered a train, except for the fact that it did not require a track and could travel at supersonic speeds. As the train hurtled forward, its soft vibrations providing a steady backdrop, Lex sat by the window, fixated on the approaching city skyline. Tall towers pierced the sky, glinting in the sunlight, each building a testament to wealth and glory of the capital city of Talea. The past few days had been spent in painful preparation for today, as he thoroughly investigated not only the layout of the city, the itinerary of the weddings, the necessary proceedings, but also thought out several plans with the help of Pell. He needed some insight into what to expect from a celestial, and what Pell told him pretty much solidified his ideas. Basically, he had no hope of hiding anything from the celestial. Even as he sat in this train, in his stealth suit, he could be assured that the heir's father already knew he was coming, and saw each and every one on his moves. The only possible way for Lex to succeed in his mission is if the celestial never interfered. If he did anything, even so much as creating an indirect obstruction, then Lex could not hope to win. But since the bet was not anything too significant, Lex could assume that the celestial would watch, but not interfere. Of course, this was on the premise that Kenta was not too valuable to Darmin, or that his father was confident that even after escaping, he would come back. All in all, there was no point in raising the bet to begin with if he intended to interfere, or at least that is the approach Lex planned on taking with his current objective. With each heartbeat, a surge of confidence coursed through him, reassured by the thought that he was prepared well enough. After all, under the guidance of his wooden ring, Lex finally got to checking out the dragon's library in the last few days. Most of the books were beyond him, and required some prerequisite knowledge that he lacked, making it so that he could not understand them despite being able to understand the individual words. Of course, there were a few books that even he could gain from. But none of that mattered. What was truly important was that Pell had guided him to a single book that he could not only comprehend, but contained knowledge that he could put to practical use, right from this very mission. All he needed to do was master the written technique. If his system was a little different, and showed him the amount of progress he made in cultivating his techniques to proficiency, then currently it would clearly show that he had, with his newfound analytic skills and powerful mind, comprehended 0.1% of the technique. While that percentage may sound abysmal and pathetic, it was only so if there was no context. The technique he was learning was not a spiritual, soul or body technique. Instead, it was one specifically to be used by Dragon's Might. As his domination grew stronger by absorbing Dragon's Might, it could also use the same technique. But even though he could only understand such a small amount, that was already enough at his level. He could subtly influence domination, and change the effect it had on people. It no longer necessarily had to suppress or pressure them, but could instead make them feel various different emotions or sensations. Of course Lex had not mastered that yet, he barely understood enough to reduce his sense of presence further. This made it so that even if people saw him, they would subconsciously ignore him. The effect was very weak right now, but when augmenting his stealth suit, the overall result was commendable. He planned on further augmenting his stealth capabilities by bringing Fenrir, but discovered that the pup had fallen into a deep sleep upon its return from Phrygia. Why did this pup sleep so much? He had only asked the question rhetorically, but Pell had provided him with a sincere answer. Lex had used a very potent and powerful binding talisman on Fenrir to bind the two together, keeping himself as the master always. He had procured the talisman from the Emporium, and other than binding the pet with the master, it had the effect of linking their cultivations. If one of them was stronger than the other, through their bond, they would influence the other as well, raising the speed at which they cultivated. If Lex had a greater cultivation level, that was great for Fenrir. But if the pup tried to gain a higher level, and thereby support Lex's cultivation, it would hit a roadblock. This was due to the fact that Lex's cultivation techniques had historically been as far outside of normal as possible. It was like tying the pup to a mountain and asking it to drag the mountain along. It just wasn't possible. So, when it encountered a situation where its cultivation was rising, the bond forcibly stopped that rise. If there was a single redeeming factor in all of this, it was the fact that all the extra energy in his body would only strengthen him further within his existing realm, and not harm him. So ultimately, Lex was helping him in the long run. As the train steadily closed the gap between him and the city, Lex's anticipation grew. The distant buildings were now distinct shapes, each one signifying a step closer to the moment of action. Unlike the town where he originally arrived, the capital felt more manufactured and less a part of nature, but that was only comparatively. Lex gathered up his thoughts, no longer musing randomly, and prepared to disembark. Planning and preparing was all good, but ultimately it was his performance that would determine everything. As soon as the train stopped, Lex got off and seemingly vanished into the crowds. The city was jam-packed, as countless beings from a multitude of races had all gathered to take part in the festivities. It was a way for them to enjoy Darman's generosity, as well as strengthen their connections with this neutral organization. A stronger bond would not mean they expected any help with their own matters, but that they could enjoy more benefits within Darman's territories. All in all, between the tourists, locals, security personnel, and foreign dignitaries, the city was jam-packed. Even for cultivators and races that could fly, there was immense traffic in the air. Anticipating this situation was one of the reasons why Lex arrived in the city hours before the ceremony happened. Silently, and without attracting any attention, Lex slowly approached the center of the city, where a grand palace stood out even when surrounded by so many majestic buildings. Getting inside the function was not difficult for Lex since he had an invitation, just time-consuming. Reaching Kenta once he was inside, however, would be the true obstacle. All guests would have designated spots where they could freely watch the ceremony, or even roam around. But the area where the ceremony was taking place could only be accessed by a select few who were important guests, relatives, or played some role in the ceremony. The ideal situation was to reach Kenta inside the palace right before he was brought to the main ceremonial altar. Slowly and steadily, as if he was not in any rush at all, Lex approached the palace without attracting any attention. He also kept his senses peeled, listening in for any latest news regarding the wedding. Even rumors might end up being useful, so he did not dismiss anything. Yet even with his slow speed, in a couple of hours, Lex had navigated his way through the massive city and approached the palace. 6 white bridges connected the city and the palace, which was built on a floating island that had been chained to the ground. Although Lex could have slipped by easily, he got in line and passed through the queue normally. When he reached the gates, he intentionally coughed loudly to attract the nearby guard's attention, before showing him his invitation. Upon gaining entry, he silently followed the guests who walked across the bridge, taking in all its majestic glory. Although Lex did not originally plan on sightseeing, he made an exception because he felt there was something usual about the bridges and the castle. His instincts seemed to have picked up on something, but it was too vague to give him a clear feeling. Nonetheless, once he reached the end, and finally approached the palace doors, Lex finally veered away from the other guests. He had no interest in going to his specified space, he only needed to find out where Kenta was. His infiltration mission was finally beginning. Chapter 808, Case Nova Lex. At the palace doors, Lex took in a deep breath as he reviewed all the information he had gathered, as well as his plan. The most ideal situation would be if the guard and staff in this castle were mostly around his level, with a few notable exceptions who would be counted as bosses. If this were a video game, that is how things would proceed. Unfortunately, real life did not operate like a video game. As Lex had personally experienced, time and time again, there were countless strong cultivators everywhere, all living their own lives. Just because you were low-leveled did not mean you would not run into them. In fact, if you went to specific areas, your chances of encountering strong cultivators would increase exponentially. As it happened, the palace where the royal family of Telea resided, which included the celestial immortal, was one such place. It was too much to expect every guard in this place to be an immortal, but surely there would be no shortage of such guards here. Moreover, no doubt there would be countless guests who were immortal as well. In fact, he would not be surprised if there were a few other celestials here as well. After all, the adopted son of a celestial was getting married. So, relying on his stealth capabilities would not get him far. He could also then rely on his wit and conversational skill to get him where he needed to go, which in fact he planned on doing to a degree, but even that would not yield adequate results. No, to complete this mission, Lex would have to rely on the most powerful tool in his utility belt, so to speak, money. Let's see, in the third-floor botanical garden. Lex murmured as he relied on his memory to guide his steps. From the Infinity Emporium Lex had bought a blueprint of the palace, or at least what was publicly available, as well as a tentative guest list for the wedding. Getting a layout of where the guards would be stationed would be impossible. Once he had that list, he gave Velma access to the Henali portal and told him to get him all the information she could on the entire guest list within 24 hours. Her success left him a little worried, actually. She was more of a Sherlock than any TV show character he had ever seen, as long as it concerned digging up dirt on someone. With that information at hand, he thought of the simplest and most direct way to get access to Kenta using this information. The more complicated and convoluted his plan, the greater the chances of messing up, considering the lack of time to prepare. As he walked the well-lit halls, rooms, and corridors, Lex tried to remain as inconspicuous as possible. When possible, he would merge into other small groups of guests who were heading in the same direction. A few times, he ran into certain checkpoints. If you crossed that point, and the invitation you had did not belong to the area you were entering, a guard would be notified. There were no drastic alarms and no serious actions that would be taken, at first, as the role of such points was to make sure that all the guests stayed in their respective places. After all, as a neutral organization, it was expected that some of their guests would actually be each other's enemies. By allocating different sections of the palace, Darmen ensured that they would not encounter one another and cause a scene. They had too much experience in avoiding such things. For Lex, this was the first hurdle that he solved with money. After all, using money, he had actually bought 108 different invitations to this event. So as to not arouse suspicion, he would keep most of them in his bangle, and only take out the one corresponding to the area he was entering to be checked. The only unfortunate thing was that all the invitations he managed to purchase were from the periphery of the palace, otherwise he would have directly bought one that allowed him to get in contact with Kenta. Like this, in only 20 minutes, he had found his way to the botanical garden on the third floor of the palace. Standing in a corner, Lex surveyed the room and looked for his target. It was not certain that she was here now, but this was most definitely the area she had a ticket to. He could wait up to an hour for her to arrive, but if by then she had not arrived, he would have to give up and rely on his plan B. After surveying the room a few times, he was unable to find her, but that much was more or less expected. After all, Lex had arrived hours early, and not everyone was inclined to wait so long. They would only arrive once the main event was about to begin. While he waited, he took note of all the guests in the botanical garden. Not every area in the palace had a view of the main ceremony, but that was fine as not all guests wanted to see it either. Some guests were instead more interested in the unique way that Telea manipulated plants. They could seemingly create new variants on a whim, and control how each of their traits were developed according to their needs. The botanical garden was where some of their more exclusive plants were nurtured. Those who came here were either biologists, pharmacists, alchemists, or belonged to some profession that would take advantage of the traits of plants. The average cultivation level of the guests here seemed to be the nascent realm, while others. Lex suddenly paused. Across the room, he saw a particular guest and, based on his information already gathered, identified the guest as a dwarf called Nanomon Helsun. His information had recorded that he had great achievements, but Lex had not paid attention to him since he could not use him. But now he realized that this dwarf, who was also in the golden core realm, seemed to give off a dangerous aura. This had never happened to him before. He had never felt danger from someone in the same realm. His curiosity was piqued, but he did not focus on him too long lest his gaze was noticed. Meeting a formidable peer was an unusual experience for him. A short while later, just as Lex was getting ready to move to Plan B, his target finally arrived. Aoi Haruki, a garden nymph, entered the room, surrounded by a few elves. She adopted an elven appearance, which was quite common here, but her soft green skin and hair that looked like small vines easily marked her as a nymph. According to her background information, she had strong relations with various elven organizations and was held in high regard due to her extremely formidable affinity with trees, even surpassing the standards of her own race. More importantly, she was a close personal friend of the princess who Kenta had flirted with before. Lex took in a deep breath, readying himself, before he walked directly to her. He stopped using domination, so that his sense of invisibility reduced, though most would still not notice him unless they saw him directly. "Pardon my intrusion," said Lex as he approached Aoi, his voice gentle and warm. Since he could not rely on his appearance to help him make a good impression, he focused heavily on his choice of words and tonality. "I could not help but approach once I recognized you. Are you really Aoi Haruki, the famous botanical breeder who saved the endangered blood rose from extinction?" His voice was filled with seemingly genuine excitement, anticipation, and passion as he asked that question. It seemed that he admired her greatly, not for any other reason than the fact that she had achieved something exceptional. It was, in fact, a remarkable achievement on Aoi's part, but not one that was widely recognized, as that particular species had only limited pharmaceutical uses, and even those could often be replaced by other plants. Aoi, who was originally surprised at being interrupted, was unexpectedly delighted to hear the question. Her achievement in altering the plant so that it could grow in a different environment, without losing any of its innate qualities and gaining any negative ones, was actually widely acclaimed but mostly only academically. Her achievement was seen as a practical example of many theoretical rules that were difficult to implement. Yet no one actually cared about the rose itself. Yet from the man's question, and the subtle passion she could feel from his words, she almost suspected he was different from the rest. Yes, that's me," she said, though she did not know why she stuttered. That was unlike her. Lex placed a hand on his heart and gave her a deep bow. "Miss Aoi, you have my deepest admiration. Although not many care about it, I believe that what you have saved is more than just a single flower. It is an emotion, nay, an experience that can only be felt when that flower blooms, and can only be expressed through poetry. Miss Aoi, I have carried this with me for many years in hopes of finding a way to save it, but have failed. If you would, I would like to give this to you, so that you may try where I have failed." Without giving her the chance to respond, Lex summoned a glass orb from his spatial bangle, and handed it to Aoi. Within it, frozen, was a beautiful white lotus the likes of which had never been seen before. Chapter 809, a poem. Aoi and her cohorts all paused as their gaze was fixed on the mesmerizing visage of the white lotus. The petals were longer than a regular lotus, spreading farther apart, and looked more beautiful. But at the same time, the cost of that beauty was an almost palpable beauty. Just looking at it alone was enough to determine that the lotus was on the verge of falling apart, and only by being sealed in that orb was it surviving. The peculiarities of the lotus went further than just that. Its texture, the thickness, or rather thinness, of each petal, the lithe stamen, were all different from what was usually seen. There was a very simple reason for that. Lex had specifically requested the sovereign turtle to create a new special of lotus for him, one that was both exceptional, beautiful, yet incredibly frail. The turtle had delivered admirably, as this was too simple for him. But, for once, the turtle had requested a payment from a single drop of dragon's blood. As Lex had appeared in front of the turtle as Leo, he could not tell how or why the turtle could tell he had dragon's blood on him, but he obliged. Of course, Lex was not capable of piercing the dragon's skin to extract blood. Instead, he used the blood he had collected from the pool where Fenrir had swum. Later, he learned that the drop of blood had been used to nurture Little Blue. Apparently, it was awakening as a beast and progressing nicely on its path. Regardless, this lotus was just one more item that Lex had prepared to ensure his success in this task. Aoi Haruki was slightly confused by Lex's statement about her saving an emotion that could only be captured by poetry, but she could sense the general positive emotion he tried to convey, which was enough for her. Before she could dwell on it, he handed her a species of a flower she had never seen before, catching her off guard. With the extent of her knowledge, it was very difficult to encounter a plant she was totally unfamiliar with. Moreover, it was also extremely beautiful, which captivated her on a level that only plants could. "Where did you get this lotus from?" "What is it called?" she asked, not lifting her eyes from the flower. Sounding pleased by her genuine curiosity, Lex answered, "I was traveling through the wilderness when I experienced an earthquake. The quake destroyed some of the terrain, and that is where I discovered a small, hidden environment filled with such lotuses. But, exposed to fresh air, they were quickly dying. I was only able to save this one. I thought it would be a shame if such a plant died without ever being admired." While Aoi looked at the plant, Lex had his gaze fixed on Aoi. Anyone watching him would think that Lex somewhat admired her, and was possibly even pursuing her. That is exactly what Lex wanted it to look like, but in truth, his target was never Aoi from the very beginning. Right beside Aoi was a seemingly ordinary-looking elven girl. Of course, even an ordinary elven girl was still earth-shatteringly beautiful by human standards. She was looking at the lotus, like everyone else, but she seemed a little distracted. "What kind of poem can be used to capture a blood rose?" she murmured, not really intending to receive an answer. But Lex, who had been specifically waiting for this moment, could not really let it slip by. After all, from the start, everything he had done was to get this girl's attention. He didn't like acting like this, but they did say the best way to attract a girl's attention was to target her best friend. As a forever bachelor, Lex would never use such tactics to actually pursue someone, but in this instance, he felt it was okay. After all, he was not really harming anyone. The blood rose was a peculiar and ominous flower that many actively avoided using, even if it could provide some meager medicinal benefits. This was because this rose only grew on battlefields once the fighting had subsided. Moreover, it did not grow in the soil, but in corpses. It would stay hidden in the body until it reached a sufficient size, whereupon it burst from the skin, emerging from the victim's heart. What was peculiar was that the rose itself was actually white, but that could only ever be discovered if it was washed. Otherwise, it would take on the color of the blood of the corpse it grew from. Without ever really looking at the elf who asked about the poem, Lex began to recite what he had prepared. A glance turned to a gaze between two eyes. An acquaintance became a friend, but not a lover. A destiny divided two souls forever. A duty brought me to arms and to a far-off battle. A blow brought me to my knees without a morrow. A life I could not give to you, but will death suffice, I wonder? A rose from the heart, for the lover who could never become a lover. His voice was low, unlike when he had talked to Aoi, and he recited the lines as if reading something that had been burned into his memory. It was only after he recited the poem that he seemed to awake from his reverie, and turned to look at the elf who had asked the question. It was supposed to be only a glance, but like the poem, he caught her eye, and the glance turned into a gaze shared by the two. Lex gulped. He was only supposed to be acting. Why did things get so intense? "Please excuse my crass poetry, I am not very good," said Lex, feeling genuine embarrassment. The poem had actually been written by himself, and while it seemed to regale a story of a dying soldier, its true purpose was to evoke a certain reaction from his target. His own awkwardness and embarrassment aside, it seemed to work. Chapter 8:10 Bet. As Lex looked at the ordinary-looking elf, countless thoughts ran through his head. If he did not have overwhelming faith in Velma's deductive work, he would really doubt that this simple elf was actually the very princess Kenta had flirted with. This was not the first time the princess had snuck out using an alternate identity, and putting all the clues together upon researching all the invited guests, Velma was willing to bet her own life that she was the princess. If Velma had such confidence in herself, then Lex should too. It's not crass. It's lovely, in its own way, the elf said, seeming distracted. She was most probably going over the lines in her head again, trying to feel the emotions in each line. The same poem read by someone who cared little for literature would be an experience that lasted a couple of seconds at most. But an enthusiast would look deeper into the meaning of each line, fulfilling the dream of every high school English teacher. They would look for the meaning behind each word, then each line, and then each stanza, and so on. On the surface, the poem seemed to be about two lovers who were denied their relationship due to a difference in their destinies. They became friends, but could never affirm their relationship. In his last moments, before death, the writer of the poem seemed to think of her again. I was inspired when I heard Kenta talking the other day, Lex said very casually. You may not know this, but he actually tried to get out of the wedding. What Lex said was not necessarily news for everyone there, as they would likely have enough resources to hear such rumors, regardless of how they were hidden. He kept referring to this marriage as if it was the end of his life, and then kept alluding to someone else he had recently met. He never said anything specific, but I let my imagination run wild a little. After all, as an heir to a neutral organization, how can he get mixed with someone else? His destiny is already laid out in front of him, and only in his final moments before his demise can he think back to that one acquaintance who could only become a friend and not a lover. Lex seemed to be speaking casually, but the elf's breathing seemed to be getting harder and her eyes seemed to be losing focus. He felt a little guilty, but at the same time, he also thought that he should not feel any guilt for creating problems for Kenta, who used the princess just to get his hands on some ingredients. Can I really have this? Aoi, who had not been listening and was instead only focused on the lotus, asked. Yes, of course. If anyone has any hope of preserving this flower, it's you. Before he could complete his sentence, the ordinary elven girl grabbed him by the collar and pulled him close. When did you talk to Kenta? When did he say all this? The elf demanded, taking the group by surprise. About 4 or 5 days ago, right before the wedding ceremonies began, Lex answered ambiguously, as if it was not something he would specifically recall. The elf struggled for a moment, as if she was undergoing some internal struggle. Is everything all right? Asked Aoi, who finally noticed the situation. Instead of answering, the elvish girl simply said, "Follow me," and turned around, bolting through the doors. Lex did not need to stop himself from smiling, since his face was hidden by a mask. There was one important point to take note of in his plan. If Velma could detect the princess' identity, then surely others could as well. That meant the only one the princess was really fooling was herself. The Tyleans would surely know who she really was, and not cause too much trouble for her. Or at least, that was what Lex was counting on as he followed her as she ran through the corridors. Beside him, Aoi seemed to be running after the elf as well, though the lotus remained firmly gripped in her hand. Lex had contingencies in case this plan failed, but he was really hoping that it didn't, because from here on out, it would become increasingly difficult to go anywhere without attracting attention. In fact, they had already attracted attention. The only thing that prevented the guards from stopping them was their hesitation when they saw the princess. There were quite a few rumors already that the heir had some kind of illicit relationship with the princess. That was drama even the guards wanted to stay away from. Every step of the way, Lex was thoroughly prepared for his plan to fail, and was even somewhat expecting it. But, somehow, it didn't. Unbelievably, no one stopped them. What he didn't realize was that this was by design. What do you think he has planned? A woman asked Kenta's father, who was seated comfortably in a private room. Who knows? The kid put some effort into his plan, but if this is all he has, he's bound to fail, the celestial replied. That's exactly what makes this bet exciting. I'll put 3 years of revenue from a crystal mine on the kid, said another elven man who was in the room. "I'll bet a bottle of holy tree sap," said another. Like this, the small crowd in this room began to bet on or against Lex. The game would officially begin when he finally met Kenta. Lex had expected that a few of the guests might be celestials, but he had sorely underestimated the number. In this room alone, there were 5 of them, and they were all elves. Moreover, they were all a part of Darmin. "If he really succeeds, what will you do?" asked one of the celestials. "What else? I'll let Kenta run around outside for a few years. We were all young once, you know how it is. Besides, what's the point of being strong if you have to constrain yourself?" Chapter 8:11 Too harsh. The trio of Lex, Aoi and the princess ran for quite a while before they finally approached the heir's quarters. Before closing in, the princess stopped and fixed her clothes and appearance and turned to glance at Aoi. That's when she noticed that Lex was there as well. "What are you doing here?" she asked, startled at the sight of him. "Didn't you ask me to follow you before you started running?" Lex responded innocently. At the same time, he looked around. He had prepared a few items which could create decoys of himself for when the princess would eventually be stopped, and he would have had to make a quick getaway. But that never happened. "No, actually never mind," she said, turning to look at Aoi. The nymph only nodded towards the elf, as if supporting her decision, though she was still not quite clear on how they went from saving a lotus to running all the way here. She looked around, now that she finally had a chance, and wondered where they were, exactly. "Do you find it strange that none of the guards stopped us?" Lex couldn't help but ask. In his mind, he had already concluded that the celestial no doubt made it easier for them. Perhaps he was interested in how Lex would actually get Kenta away from here, and wanted to skip the tedious part where Lex navigated through the palace to actually reach him. Little did he know, his assumption was extremely close to the truth, with one alteration. It was not the heir's father who was impatient, but one of his companions who wanted to see how the drama between the princess and the heir would unfold. This was better than any reality TV show. To be clear, they were not concerned about any of the so-called saving face, as that kind of mentality was mainly adopted by the Central Elven Alliance, which was made up of a majority of the elves. But it was also specifically to avoid such a mentality that too many forces and organizations distanced themselves from the alliance as well. "Let's not find out," the princess said, realizing that it really should not have been so easy for them to approach. Could it have been Kenta? Could he have been hoping that she would come in his last moments to see him? Her emotions welled up, but she forced herself to remain calm, and slowly began to approach the closed door. Unlike Lex, who had trained himself to remain calm even in a life-and-death situation, let alone this, and Aoi, who still had no idea where they were, the princess was extremely nervous. With each step she took, her heat started to beat faster. In her head, she struggled to come up with what she wanted to say to Kenta. Over and over again, she thought of her words, and then changed her mind. She also wondered what Kenta was going through. Was he in anguish? Was he sad? Was he in denial? The hallway was not endless, so she could not complete her thoughts before she finally approached the door to his room. There was not a lot of time, so she did not hesitate and knocked on the door. Behind her, Lex was keeping an eye out for any guards. Once he reached Kenta, this was basically a done deal. He would probably also take Aoi and the princess along as well, to apologize to them for using them in such a way. A few moments went by, but the door did not open and they could not hear any movement on the other side. Of course, there was also a possibility that all sound was insulated, so they kept waiting. Finally, just as even Lex was getting impatient, the door finally opened to reveal a disheveled-looking Kenta. His hair was a mess, and he looked like he had just woken up from a coma. Although he had cleaned it, Lex could tell that the heir had been drooling as well. Was it really alright for one to be in such a state only a couple of hours before their own wedding? Lex had made up the poem, so why did it actually look like he was suffering from love sickness? Before the heir could take in who had come to visit him, and before anyone had a chance to speak, the princess slapped him hard across the face. How dare you be thinking of other women before your own wedding? Have you no shame? She questioned him, her voice extremely harsh. Aoi, Kenta, and Lex were all stunned by what just happened. The Celestials who were also watching became even more invested, as none of them had predicted this outcome. Internally, the princess chided herself. That was a little too harsh. Let's try again, a little gentler this time, she thought. I mean, Kenta, you are about to begin a very important phase of your life. You should not put a stain on a new relationship by starting it this way, she said, her voice suddenly going from extremely harsh to extremely delicate and vulnerable. From her voice, it seemed as if she was experiencing heartbreak even as she said those words. Please excuse my manners, but, do I know you? Kenta asked, as the princess slap helped him sober up somewhat. Lex, who had originally planned on immediately teleporting everyone away, decided to wait a bit and allow the princess to vent her emotions somewhat. He had no qualms about letting the heir take all the slaps on his behalf for stirring up trouble. Alright, a part of him was secretly pissed that the heir had made him pay for the food. It was not about the money, but the embarrassment he faced when the shopkeeper thought he was dining and dashing. The princess finally remembered that she was still in her ingenious and infallible disguise. She looked at him once apologetically, as if she knew revealing herself before him would no doubt give him feelings of hope and delight. But since it could not be, these emotions had to be quashed right now. Chapter 8:12 Exit. Only Kenta, the princess, Oi, and Lex were present in the hallway. There had been a few guards standing there awkwardly, but once the heir got slapped, they vanished as if their life depended on it. Lex was more than happy to let the princess vent on Kenta, while Oi was shocked and had her mouth covered with her hand. She was wondering since when had the princess become so violent? But at the same time, she felt that this was so different and exciting for her normal life of study and research. A fire was lit up deep inside the nymph's heart, unbeknownst to herself and anyone else. Not dragging the matter further, the princess revealed her true appearance. It took Kenta a moment to recognize her, which immediately startled him. What is she doing here? He questioned in his heart as he suddenly began to panic. This was not good. He wasn't even married yet, but if his to-be wife heard rumors of him meeting another woman literally hours before their marriage, he would be doomed. What are you doing here? He could not stop himself from asking. He had intended to be more tactful in his wording, but his anxiety got the better of him. His tumultuous emotions did not go unnoticed by the princess, who took it as an affirmation of all her thoughts. Lightsville, Kenta, we're elves, from two different worlds. We cannot be together. I'll forgive you for your actions back then, but you must put this matter behind us. How can I put this behind us when you're here? He asked, a headache starting to develop. He had already forgotten about her, but she came knocking on his door asking to let bygones be bygones, which was the most ridiculous thing ever. He would be more than happy to let this matter rest, but she would have to not randomly show up at his door first. Kenta, I didn't want it to come to this, but I don't feel the same way as you. This cannot work. You don't feel the same? He repeated, feeling devastated. Was his flirting so powerful? Had he gotten her to fall in love with him after a single meeting? Could she no longer ignore him? But princess, you're at my wedding, he exclaimed, trying to convey to her that he simply couldn't be with her. He was already in over his head with one wife who he was being forced to have. If he had to deal with a scorned lover on the side, his life would become complete chaos. Exactly, the princess exclaimed, trying to explain to this dumb love-struck fool that she couldn't be with him. It's your wedding. You have to get married, just not to the elf you want. Trust me, ultimately, things will turn out for the best this way. Aoi was teetering with excitement as she tried to figure out what was happening. She was filling in the blanks herself, and coming up with a love story for the ages. Lex, on the other hand, was trying his best to suppress his laughter. It was a good thing his expressions couldn't be seen under his mask, or else it would become evident how hard it was for him to keep a straight expression. No, this can't be happening, the heir said as he turned away from them and walked back into his room, his thoughts swirling. He had to think of a solution, and fast. How had things gotten so out of control? He was only trying to get his hands on some ingredients. The princess, who was trying out the soft approach, was losing her patience now. What the hell was wrong with this guy? Why was he so adamant? Sure, she was beautiful. But that was no reason to harass her with his undying, poem-inspiring love. Suddenly her thoughts paused. Wait a minute, if the part about him being married was removed, and it was true that his love was really so great, he wasn't a bad candidate. No, what the hell am I thinking? Having recovered from her momentary lapse in judgment, the princess became irritated and followed the heir into his room. Lex could feel that the situation was escalating, so he decided to end it soon and take them all to the inn before something unexpected happened. Let's follow them in, he said to Aoi, before walking behind the princess. Listen pal, this is happening whether you like it or not. Forget about your own problems for a second and think about how I feel. Why do I have to get dragged into this mess? Kenta, who was panicking, suddenly paused. Yes, the poor princess. If he was having such a tough time, how did the princess who had fallen in love with him feel? Before Kenta had an opportunity to respond, Lex cleared his throat. If I may interrupt, I believe I have the solution to all your problems, said Lex as he walked closer to the two, making sure Aoi was close by as well. Lex? Kenta asked, suddenly recognizing the voice. By his completely covered appearance it was difficult to identify him, especially since there were few races who preferred to stay completely covered. It was only when he spoke that Kenta realized who he was, and a crazy thought came to his mind. Was he actually trying to help him escape the wedding? Seriously? I'm glad you recognize me, Lex said, his voice warm. That will make things easier. He summoned an envelope from his spatial ring and placed it on a table nearby, and took out 3 golden keys and handed one to each of them. What's this going to do? Asked the princess, who was irritated now. Having ordinary elves fall in love with her was not enough. Now that she had to deal with one who had massive power and influence, she really wanted to resolve the situation lest it become something that bothered her throughout her life. I'll explain in a moment, said Lex as he initiated his own return to the inn. Since it took a few moments he waited patiently in silence, and just as the time was about to be up, he used his spirit sense to crush the keys in their hands. All 4 of them vanished at the same time. Chapter 8:13 Happily Kidnapped. Within a millionth of a second after the 4 disappeared, 5 celestials appeared in the room. There was a look of intrigue in their eyes as they scanned the room but could not detect any lingering traces from their teleportation, which was extremely unusual. It had to be known that even if they themselves teleported somewhere, they would leave behind some traces that could be sensed or detected. Of course, if they planned far in advance and prepared meticulously, they could teleport somewhere without leaving any residual traces from the laws of space, but even that was conditional. Moreover, they were in the official peak realm of the origin realm. How could someone in the Golden Core compare to them? The answer was simple. They couldn't. That left only one explanation for what had just occurred. The golden keys that Lex had handed out had been supreme treasures, the likes of which could not be easily procured. The heir's father picked up the envelope left behind by Lex and opened it. Within lay a small letter explaining that Lex had taken Kenta to a place called Midnight Inn, which was, as was evident from the name, an inn. Lex had also left behind a couple of golden keys in the envelope as well, in case the father wanted to investigate. Although he had been brief, he had given somewhat of an overview of the inn, as well as the fact that it was an entity recognized by the Hanali, so there was no cause for concern. He could come and check it out himself if he so wished. It seems we are behind the times, said one of the Celestials as he read the letter. Are you going to go? Asked another, though it was clear that he could not have cared less. He was, instead, enjoying the fact that he had won his bet. I will go, yes. But first, I need to confirm with the Hanali if what is written in this letter is true. It would be tragic if this all was an elaborate ploy to trap me, and I went in without any preparations. Suit yourself, said another Celestial, before disappearing away. None of them were really concerned about the wedding. Even if Kenta did not appear, they could just use their abilities to create a projection of Kenta as a stand-in. Regardless of whether the heir was here or not, he would be getting married today. The three holding the keys did not feel the teleportation at all, as it was very different from normal teleportations which would have various negative effects. For them, one moment they were in Kenta's room, and another they were in an entirely new place. The entrance of the inn, where all new guests would teleport to, was elaborately decorated without being overdone. There was greenery, there was man-made architecture, there was a massive flowing river nearby in case any of the guests were aquatic, and there were many more features that made the place look like paradise. Lex's own visit to Zuriadis's planet had given him a unique perspective of what guests must feel like when they entered the Midnight Inn, and he used that to improve the landing zone, to improve all guests' first impressions. A natural, exquisite fragrance from nearby flowers specially grown by the turtle elevated everyone's mood and heightened their senses. The pure, unpolluted spiritual energy of the inn was extraordinarily appealing to nature-loving races like elves and nymphs, even more so than others. It was for that reason that the three, instead of being alarmed or frightened by the sudden change in their location, became mesmerized. They forgot that they were caught up in a heated argument, and forgot their impending responsibilities. They were too preoccupied enjoying the purity of the environment. Lex also did not disturb them, as he wanted them to temper their anger as much as possible. After all, Kenta aside, he would have to apologize to two possibly furious ladies he had somewhat manipulated. At the same time, he was also feeling extremely satisfied at a successful mission. He would soon be free from one of the inscriptions on his body. Eventually, Kenta recovered and turned to look at Lex. He was the first to understand the whole situation, and guessed that Lex had a hand in the princess' arrival at his doorstep at such a time, though he did not know if her feelings for him were genuine. Being charming was such a burden, he could not really blame her for falling for him. Seeing that Kenta had recovered, Lex decided to delay things no further. He cleared his throat, attracting the attention of the princess and Aoi, before saying, "Welcome to the Midnight Inn, the best inn in all the universe. I believe I have some explaining to do, though. How about we relocate to a more private location first?" Neither Aoi nor the princess voiced any complaints. Although they should have been concerned, for they had just possibly been kidnapped, but their intuition said that this was a safe place. Moreover, there were countless others arriving and leaving here beside them, and they could see various guests being welcomed with a similar greeting, claiming the inn to be the best in the universe. Nodding his head, Lex led them towards one of the public transport facilities nearby, and procured them all peacocks to ride. By now, having lived in the inn for so long, the peacocks had all grown tremendously strong bodies, and a few of them had evolved into beasts as well, albeit only in the chi training realm. They had grown larger, more beautiful and better capable of carrying guests of all shapes and sizes. They even had saddles, though none of them opted for a saddle. Each of them got on the peacock as if they had been riding them since birth, though their fascination with the birds clearly stated otherwise. Chapter 8:14 Tour. Lex led the way, guiding his peacock to follow the flowing river. Over the past few months, the planning division had slowly and steadily been providing him with plans and blueprints to develop the various empty areas of the inn. A majority of the inn was occupied by wilderness. That had not changed, but by organizing it somewhat, and doing some basic landscaping, the outlook changed drastically. Lex could not help but think back to when he originally got the inn. At that time, Lex was doing things randomly and half-heartedly, without really considering how things would work out. He recalled how, when he initially brought in various birds, he had not considered their feed at all. If it weren't for one of his guests, Helen, who began feeding them, many of them may have died. Speaking of whom, Lex hadn't seen her in a while. He hoped she was all right. All in all, things had changed a lot in the last year and a half. But at the same time, these changes also made him excited for the future. It was a pleasant change from the days where he would wallow in his own depression. "I would like to begin by apologizing to you both," Lex said as he addressed Aoi and the princess. "Truth be told, I needed to reach Kenta, and well, I had a feeling I could reach him through you. Lex tried to give them an apologetic look before he recalled that he was wearing a mask. Does that mean that he isn't obsessed with me? The princess asked, her voice hopeful. Ah, no, he isn't, Lex admitted honestly, though a small part of him had wished the misunderstanding would have continued. It was quite entertaining to watch. Instead of being angry at Lex, the princess only breathed out a sigh of relief. Kenta, who was listening to everything from the side, felt slightly offended at how relieved the princess was. Then he recalled that he too had been fretting about her being obsessed with him, and now that he knew it wasn't true no actually, he didn't feel relieved, just disappointed. Seeing that no verbal abuse was being flung his way, Lex felt relieved, and continued speaking. To make it up to you, I'll introduce you to the Midnight Inn. Moreover, I'll cover your stay here. Feel free to stay as long as you like and enjoy yourself. Whenever you wish to leave, you need only think about it, and you'll be teleported back to where we entered from. Moreover, you'll get a copy of the golden key, so you can come here again whenever you wish. Is anyone welcome here? Aoi asked as she held out her hands and let them gently caress the leaves from the small bushes they passed. It looked like she was just appreciating them, but Lex could sense that she was actually communicating with the plants. Moreover, they were responding. Even Lex had not talked to the plants at the inn. In fact, he didn't even know that was possible. Maybe this was a unique trait of nymphs. Was this your plan from the beginning? Kenta asked, as he finally realized where Lex's confidence came from. Are you a part of the Midnight Inn? Haha, no, I'm not from the inn, just a normal guest. But yes, my confidence in taking you away came from being able to teleport to the inn from anywhere. You may not know this, but here, inside the inn, even a celestial immortal is not a big deal, said Lex, though the reality was far from the truth. There have been a few times people tried to attack the inn, but each time the innkeeper killed every one of them. So, over here, I'm not really worried about anything. Now that you're here, you can finally run away from your wedding. If you raise your privilege level high enough, you can teleport away to another planet without needing to return to Talea. You are officially free to do as you please. Kenta smiled wryly. He was free, but at the same time, was he really? Could he give up the temptation of reaching an unbelievably high cultivation realm just so he could pursue some fantasy called freedom? Moreover, was such freedom even a good thing to begin with? Kenta shook his head without answering. Both he and his adopted father knew that he would return to Talea, eventually. However, there was nothing preventing him from enjoying himself in the meantime. His grin widened. Lex, I have a fantastic idea. If anyone can teleport here from anywhere, then, isn't this the best place in the universe to get ingredients? I can get the best ingredients from across the universe and open up the best restaurant. Excitement filled his eyes, and he started to pant as more and more ideas flooded into his mind. If it was really possible, if he could really do this. Joining the inn is not exactly easy. You have to take a test and completely join the inn. That means if you would ever hope to return to Darman, it might be an issue, since it's completely neutral and cannot be affiliated with any other organization. But who knows, maybe you can just rent out a place from the inn and open your restaurant. You'd still have to prove yourself first, though. Instead of responding to Lex, Kenta looked towards the princess with heated eyes. What do you say, Asami? With your divine produce, and my cooking skills, we could dash. Kenta was too distracted to dodge the shoe the princess threw at him. She had suffered enough, thanks to this idiotic heir, and wanted nothing more to do with him. Lex, how about a tour of this place, she asked instead, her gaze turning towards their mysterious tour guide. By the way, did you really write that poem yourself or was that made up as well? No, that was really me, Lex admitted. If you want a tour, I have a few ideas. If you want to see anywhere specific, I can take you there. But if you want to see the entire inn, then the train is the best option. Lex began to introduce the various features of the inn, not at all noticing the unusual glint in the princess's eyes. Meanwhile, Kenta rubbed his nose as he began to rethink his plan. Apparently relying on his charm to procure the best ingredients was not feasible. Chapter 8:15 Awkward. Lex spent the next few hours accompanying the princess, Asami, as well as Aoi and Kenta. He had introduced various aspects of the inn to them, while at the same time learned a lot about them and their backgrounds as well. It also expanded his understanding of Swera. A galaxy, any galaxy at all, was usually occupied by millions of different races. Most galaxies were not owned or controlled by any one race. In fact, most galaxies barely had any civilization capable of proper interstellar travel. Swera happened to be one of the galaxies which had seen the advance of two different races, so much so that over the course of time, they occupied a majority of it. That was not to say other races were exterminated, but that most races that would try to fight against the expansion of those two races had been eliminated. Those two races were elves and dwarves. All other races that existed and prospered within the galaxy were linked to those two races in one way or another, similar to how Aoi usually worked with elves. The elves and dwarves used to be at war, but only recently called for a ceasefire and, surprising everyone, even became allies. Since he was mostly with elves, he learned a lot about their culture and learned that the elves, well, a nice way of putting it was that they were quite conservative. And racist. And traditionalists. The main body of elves consisted of various clans and organizations who joined together to form the Central Elven Alliance. The elves in that alliance were quite conservative in the sense that for millions of years they had adhered to the norms and traditions of their ancestors, did not like change, and shunned anyone who tried to bring change. But if one adhered to those few principles, they were quite friendly. But when the race spread so far and wide, there were naturally outliers. Many elves did not want to spend their lives worshipping trees, being vegetarian and adhering to rules that did not make sense to them. The existence of this group nearly caused a civil war. How exactly that dispute was resolved was unknown, even to the younger generation of elves, such as Asami and Kenta. What truly mattered was that these outliers eventually split from the main, and formed their own organizations and their own traditions. Both Asami and Kenta belonged to such factions. Aoi was, naturally, a subordinate of Asami technically speaking, though due to their friendship they did not treat it as such. Unlike Kenta, whose background made it so that he was limited in what he could do, Asami did not come from a neutral organization. In fact, her background was quite polarized because they had a monopoly on what was called the sacred harvest. The elves weren't too keen on elaborating what the sacred harvest was, just that it was very helpful for elves' growth. To be honest, taking the group around the inn was originally to get rid of his guilt for using them and wait for the Celestials' arrival, but as time went by, he was glad he was doing this. Although he did not mind continuing to cultivate rigorously as he had been, it was beginning to build up a pressure that he had not noticed. It was only now, that he was casually strolling around with a few acquaintances, that he realized how long it had been since he just relaxed with a few friends. But all good things must eventually come to an end. Lex, Kenta's father has arrived at the inn, informed Mary. Send someone to guide him to us, replied Lex, and turned to look at Kenta. It looks like your old man is about to arrive. Indeed, just as he finished his sentence, the heir's father arrived, as if teleporting over. The only thing was, he wasn't alone. Beside him was another elf, in a wedding dress made of flowers and leaves. Congratulations, my boy, you're married, the heir's father said, a sly grin on his face. Congratulations, Asami said immediately as well, as if mocking him. Congratulations, Lex followed along as well, a wide grin on his face, though no one could see it. By this point, he was just being petty about the whole payment thing. Kenta froze, unable to process what was happening, until eventually he turned to look at his wife. It's nice to meet you, he said, somewhat awkwardly. It would have been nice if you attended your own wedding, his wife responded, clearly not happy with him. I was kidnapped, Kenta quickly defended himself. She turned to look at Lex, as if she knew he was responsible for what happened. Your father-in-law and I had a bet over whether I could do it or not. I'm quite competitive, and got carried away. My apologies, it won't happen again, said Lex proactively. She only shook her head and turned and looked back at Kenta. My name is Sohi Haru, now that I have taken on your last name. Wait, Sohi, does that mean? Yes, before you, I was the heir of Talea. Kenta froze again, and this time, so did everyone else. Did Kenta just get married to the person he replaced? How awkward was that? It seemed that no matter how petty Lex was, he could not match up to the standard of Kenta's own parents. Looking away from them, Lex turned his attention to the celestial immortal. Senior, I was giving everyone a tour of the Midnight Inn. Would you like a tour as well? Little brat, I have over 100,000 guests waiting for me back at the palace. I have no time for a tour. I'll be leaving my worthless son here for a while, but come by after 2 days. I will do, as I promised, and help you remove your inscription. As for the tour, it will have to wait for a while. With that, the heir's father left the inn, leaving them in silence. Everyone turned to look at Kenta and Sohi once again, who were just staring at one another in silence. Suddenly, Lex felt glad that he was single. Chapter 8:16 Gamer Dragon. After spending some time together, Lex felt like he had developed a bit of friendship with the group of 3. But with the addition of Sohi, Kenta's new wife, the group became extremely awkward and silent. Anytime Kenta would try to talk to Sohi, or even talk at all, she would say something that would shut him up. She would say things like, if I had to be replaced by someone, I at least hoped it was someone competent, or I'm glad to see that even after getting married you can be such good friends with the princess you were caught flirting with. Honestly, Lex had no idea how he could remedy the situation. Although he tried a few times to smooth things over, it seemed like Sohi was just in a very bad mood right now, not that Lex could blame her. Ultimately, Lex could not take the awkward silence anymore. He told the group that their stay was sponsored by him, to make up for the fact that he had kidnapped them all. He also let Kenta know that he would help him talk to someone from the inn, and if he could impress them, then maybe he had a chance of opening a restaurant there. Then he informed them that he had some work to do, and he disappeared as quickly as possible. Mary informed Velma about the unique situation with Kenta, Asami, and his wife. I'm sure she will be extremely intrigued. At the same time, have her judge if Kenta is a good cook. If he really can cook well, there's no harm in having him as a cook. It's always better to find people who have a passion for such things. He had 2 days before he needed to return to Talea. He did not expect Hicks to find barley anytime soon, but checking in once in a while was not a bad idea. In the meantime, he would continue his cultivation sessions. The more of the blade of grass he ate, the more he built an affinity for it. That meant he could eat more of the grass while having to endure less pain afterwards. Moreover, although for now the change was very subtle, he could tell he was healing much faster than before. The best part was, Lex no longer needed to blindly guess why this was happening. With Pell around, he could ask him questions and receive adequate answers. Although the ring had a majority of its memories still sealed, what it recalled was enough for Lex for now. How come I'm healing quicker after gaining an affinity for the healing law? Am I developing some kind of new bloodline? Or am I mutating into another species? Lex asked Pell during his next cultivation session. Neither, although becoming a new species is somewhat closer to the answer than your other guesses. In cultivation, up until the nascent realm, with each new realm your strength grows a definite amount. That means, irrespective of your own personal skills or attributes, the new realm itself gives you new and greater strength. However, that changes once you step into the immortal realms. From the immortal realms onwards, a majority of a cultivator's powers comes from their tenets or laws, and tenets basically rely on laws anyway, so they don't really count. That's an oversimplification of the situation, but you can take it as such. Anyway, in that realm, cultivators actively use those laws to bring about various effects. Your body, by gaining an affinity for those laws, is not biologically becoming better able to heal. Instead, it uses those laws passively, to a very minute extent, and somewhat allows you to touch upon those laws before you actually reach a sufficient realm to do so. In simple terms, you have a cheat. For example, you look at things in the form of a video game. Imagine you are at level 1, but gain a weapon that's level 10. You can't really use it, because you're too weak, but sometimes just holding it is enough to gain benefits from its passive effects. Upon hearing all that, Lex became stunned. "Don't tell me that in your previous life you were a gamer," he exclaimed. Why was a former dragon turned spirit realm giving him examples from video games? "In my previous life I lived for millions of years. In my previous life I had indulged in pretty much every kind of entertainment and time pass that was ever invented." Lex was stunned, but upon consideration, figured that it only made sense. Moreover, with that much time on his hands, he bet Pell grinded all games until he got 100% achievements. Suddenly, Lex gained massive respect for the dragon. He was still going to use its living corpse as a cultivation mat, but that did not change the fact that he now felt massive respect for it. Like that, he spent the next 2 days either cultivating atop the dragon to raise his cultivation, or raising his affinity with the laws of regrowth by eating the blade. Once enough time had passed, and he was about to return to Talea, Lex paused to see how his recovery was going. It was difficult to tell, but he swore he could see a faint layer of skin forming below the scab that had covered his entire body. But, once that was done, Lex could no longer ignore the one painful thing he had been trying to avoid. He finally checked in on Kenta, his wife and the rest, and was immediately stumped. Why was the situation so different? Velma, Sohi, and Asami were riding a roller coaster and laughing as they giggled to one another, while Kenta was buying groceries at the guild room. Aoi was in the greenhouse talking to Zen, the small patch of grass that had gained sentience and become an immortal all at once, despite having an extremely frail body. Aoi and Kenta were acting within his expectations, but since when had Sohi, Velma, and Asami become such good friends? Chapter 817 ended before it began. "Mary, has anything strange happened with the group while I was cultivating?" Lex asked. It was not that he had a bias against Sohi, but that their first meeting was genuinely too awkward. He did not blame her, for she had probably been forced to marry the very elf who replaced her as the heir to such a powerful force. It was only normal for there to be some bitterness and resentment. Mary, who appeared above Lex, this time dressed as Cupid, opened her mouth to speak, but paused. After some hesitation, she simply said, "Velma is very extroverted, as you know. Plus all things related to romance excite her to no end. As a result, she is very good at dealing with such things." She cleared up all the misunderstandings between the group, and now Asami and Sohi at least are good friends. Kenta and Sohi have also decided to work on their relationship, for it won't really benefit anyone if they stay at odds. She gave Lex an odd look, but then disappeared before he noticed anything. It may not seem like it, but Lex was extremely perceptive, especially when it came to things related to himself. At least that's how he was with the system and all things related to cultivation. Other, simpler things seemed to go over his head. With Mary's reassurance, Lex relaxed, and decided to teleport over and ask them if any of them planned on returning with him. As much as he liked hanging out with the group, this was probably the last time he was going to have an opportunity. After all, he had to use his time wisely and cultivate as much as possible. When he teleported over to Kenta, the elf boldly declared that he did not plan on returning to Talea for the next few years while he fulfilled his passion for opening up a restaurant. Anyway, he was already married now, so his adopted father could be relieved that there was someone to watch over him and keep him out of trouble. He was not really needed for anything special for a while. Aoi, likewise, claimed that she wanted to spend some more time here. She was trying to get the turtle to acknowledge her as a student, but the turtle itself was a baby. How could it focus on teaching? All its attention was focused on playing around. Well, that's what Lex thought, but he did not say that aloud. When he approached the 3 girls, however, he had an odd interaction. So he stared at him intently, as if studying him, while Velma giggled a little. Asami, the princess, accepted his offer to return with him. After all, she had disappeared without warning. Although she was enjoying the inn, she needed to go report to her family and continue with her duties. After saying farewell to Asami, so he glared at Lex once, before turning away. There was definitely something wrong with her. How did you get over the awkwardness? Lex asked, unable to contain himself. It was a delicate matter. I could not outright say that I disliked Kenta to her, as that would be insulting her husband in front of her. Yet I had to assure her that I had no interest in him either. Velma made the process easier, and once all the misunderstandings were cleared, we became good friends. Honestly, so he is quite nice. She's just slightly cautious, because she's lost her position before, and so doesn't easily feel safe with her new circumstances. Once she opens up, however, she's a nice person. You should also take the chance to get to know her. Perhaps you could read her some of the poetry you wrote. That might make her more amenable to you. Though, I don't recommend the one about the blood rose. Haha, I don't really have much experience writing poetry, Lex confessed. That was the first time I actually did so. I don't really see myself writing any more anytime soon either. That's a shame, Asami said simply, and looked at Lex from the side of her eyes. In her mind, she could not help but think how apt his poem was. The two could become friends, but not lovers. Their station and destinies lay elsewhere, thoroughly dividing them. He said he only wrote it casually, so then why could she feel the emotions in that poem so deeply herself? For the briefest of moments, Asami felt weak. But the moment passed, and she collected herself. Shall we go? She asked. Lex nodded and said, you only need to think of returning. You will immediately be teleported back. The two, an elf and a human, a princess and a universal entrepreneur, disappeared at the same time and reappeared in Kenta's room. Though they journeyed together for this brief period, their paths were ultimately diverging. It was unknown if they would even have the opportunity to meet again. I have to report to my family, said Asami, her voice oddly gentle. Let us part here. In that case, farewell. If you come to the Midnight Inn again, you can try looking for me. Although I'm usually busy, I also spend a lot of time there. The princess simply nodded and walked away. Lex stood there for a moment and watched her leave. He was not completely oblivious to what was happening, and considering the newfound friendship between Asami, Sohei, and Velma, he could somewhat understand why Sohei was glaring at him. But somehow, the relationship between him and this princess ended before it even began. Honestly speaking, Asami was indeed very beautiful, and they did seem to hit it off during the short time they spent together. But just because she was beautiful, or just because they got along, did not mean that he would become desperate to be with her. Lex scratched his head, but then turned his attention elsewhere. He did not have the luxury to think about romance with danger looming over his immediate future. The princess, who was walking away, contacted her family and filled them in on what had happened the last couple of days. Before she ended the call, she requested a patch of blood roses to be grown in her personal garden, the ones Aoi had altered so that they could grow anywhere. The princess had become fond of them. Chapter 818 Inscriptions. With the princess departing on her way, Lex could now proceed towards the heir's father. He did not need to go looking for him, for an attendant already stood there waiting for Lex's arrival. Mr. Lex? I have been instructed to bring you to the guest's library when you're ready. Lead the way, Lex said, allowing the attendant to lead him through the palace. While he crossed the unnecessarily complicated pathway, Lex could not help but think that he had been to quite a few places, labyrinths and ancient lairs. The grandeur of the place no longer seemed to affect him. Yes, everything was rich and fancy, and giving off extremely pure spiritual energy, and tinged with a lovely aroma. So, the basic standard then. That was not to say that the palace wasn't spectacular. It just didn't grab Lex's attention the way these things used to. He passed the indoor garden, behind the waterfall of spirit water, through the corridor that seemed to contain miniaturized stars as lights, above the... Wait, what? Lex stopped and looked up, finding it hard to believe what his senses were telling him. No, those were not fairy lights on the ceiling, they were actual stars that had been shrunk and placed there. Alongside a dim, gentle light, the stars seemed to be giving off extremely pure yet mild spirit energy. Alright, he admitted it, that was a new one. When he finally reached the library, he discovered that he was not the only one waiting there. Beside him, there was the dwarf Lex had seen previously, the one he felt a threat from. As if that was not enough, accompanying the dwarf was someone from a race Lex did not recognize who also gave off a threatening aura. Besides those two, there were a few others, but Lex did not pay attention to them. He felt a strong urge to go and challenge the dwarf immediately to a fight. His body started heating up and his heart started beating faster, but just before the urge overwhelmed him, Lex looked away. In his right eye, a faint image of a sword had appeared, though it was diminishing now. Lex had realized that his reaction wasn't normal, and immediately picked out that he was being influenced by the sword again. A worthy challenger seemed to stimulate the sword, but not enough to make Lex lose himself. He went and sat down in a corner, closed his eyes, and began to meditate. He didn't like the fact that there was something that could affect his mind, but since there was nothing he could do about it for the moment, he would treat it as training his mind. One by one, the people in the library were called, and each of them were escorted to different rooms. It seemed like this was the waiting area for anyone who had an appointment, although Lex doubted that all of them were going to meet the celestial immortal. Whatever the case, it had nothing to do with him. He was focused on maintaining a steady mind, right up until an attendant arrived and escorted him further. When he left the room, the dwarf finally looked towards where Lex had gone. He was sure that Lex was about to challenge him, as the dwarf had felt a very fierce aura targeting him, before it withdrew on its own. Not that he was afraid. When Lex was finally brought to the heir's father, he was surprised to see that the immortal was sitting cross-legged inside a formation, with a smaller formation placed in front of him, seemingly prepared for Lex. Lightsville not only did the formations look extremely complicated and expensive, but he could tell that there were a number of spirit items active in the room as well, though he could not determine their use. "Sit," the celestial immortal said without opening his eyes, only raising a hand to indicate that Lex should sit within the prepared formation. "I have a few questions for you before we begin. I hope you understand that I am not prying, but that this is necessary information." "Please, ask," said Lex as he sat down. It seemed like these inscriptions were an even bigger deal than he assumed. He thought that it would be a simple task for someone so strong to remove the inscriptions from him. It seemed he was wrong. "First, are you aware of who put these inscriptions on your body?" "I cannot say for certain," confessed Lex. "Although if I had to guess, I would say one of my parents." "Do you know the cultivation realm of your parents?" he asked, but then realized something and didn't give Lex a chance to answer. "Wait, you are a human. If you suspect that your parents did this, is Jotun your father?" No, he's not, although I'm most likely related to him. His brother is my family's ancestor. As for my parents' cultivation realm, I am not sure. We have a complicated relationship." The immortal could not help and open his eyes as he looked at Lex, countless unknown thoughts running through his head. "It seems the human race is prospering more than I was aware. Based on your answer, I take it you do not know any details of the ones who put this inscription on you, yes?" "That is correct. I did not even know about these inscriptions until Senior Zuri informed me of them." The immortal pondered for a moment before he spoke again. "The reason I am asking all these questions is that the more I know, the easier the process shall be. What language these inscriptions are in, what is the logic behind them, and how they were placed are all secrets even from me. They are most ingenious, as they have been placed in such a way that they have become a part of your body itself, just as much as your heart and brain are a part of you. Removing them, without harming you, will not be a simple task." Chapter 819 Thanks for the meal. Lex's mood dropped as he considered the ramification of the immortal words. The inscriptions had become a part of his body, and at the moment were not really harming him in any way. It was only if he tried to become an immortal that they would pollute his body, according to what the celestial had informed him previously. Yet at the same time, even for a celestial, it was not simple to remove them. No wonder the system had never picked up on them. Even his tumor, although a part of his body, was actively harming him. But worry not, the immortal continued. Although it is not simple, all it requires is a little preparation. I can still do it. Actually, if I wasn't concerned about not harming you, it would be easy to remove the inscriptions. They are not that strong. It's just maintaining your health that is the complicated part. Well, I'm glad you are concerned about my health, Lex said wryly. It would be quite problematic otherwise. Remove all your clothing, as well as all items and jewelry, and set them aside. I will begin momentarily. Lex froze for a moment, but then he had no choice but to comply. He took off his clothes without any hesitation, as if he was not feeling extremely awkward and embarrassed. Though he could not decide if it was being naked which was embarrassing him, or the fact that he was skinless. He folded everything and put it neatly on a table, before taking his place inside the formation once again. Brace yourself, this is going to hurt. Before Lex had an opportunity to respond, the formation was activated and Lex felt an unquestionably massive force gripping his body, preventing him from moving. Then, the force entered his body. Holy dash! Lex was not able to complete what he was saying for he fell unconscious, a defense mechanism of his body. The Celestial activated another formation, the job of which was to act as life support, but then realized that Lex's body was actually quite tenacious, and despite the immense pressure it was under, showed no signs of collapsing or shutting down. The mystery deepens, the immortal mused, before turning his attention to the inscriptions. Based on what he could tell, all the inscriptions were a form of protection for Lex. He could not determine what the one on his forehead did, for it had deteriorated on its own, but the one in his heart seemed to be hiding an innate feature of his body. The one on his neck seemed to be a tracker. He could not decide which one to remove, for all three of them were in extremely delicate places, where even the slightest deviation of energy could kill Lex. Whoever placed these there in the first place was extremely skilled. The immortal spent some time trying to decide which one to remove, and ultimately decided on the tracker. Of the three, the one in Lex's heart was the most difficult to remove, while the one on the skull had already deteriorated on its own. In a few years, it may even vanish entirely. That only left the one on his neck. Once decided, the immortal did not hesitate. Although Lex's body did not require the life support formation, he activated it nonetheless, and began the process. Slowly, ever so slowly, his own energy seeped into Lex's body, traveled through his meridians, and reached his neck. His energy simply wafted the inscription, before moving on. He was supposed to channel the energy out of Lex's body as it was not contaminated, but something unusual happened. Before he could take it out, the energy was absorbed directly by Lex's body. Just as the immortal was alarmed, and even considered stopping the operation lest something unexpected happens, a spirit sense connected to his mind and transmitted a message. "Thank you for the meal, Senior," said the lotus, who had been roused from his slumber due to the delectable energy coursing through Lex's body. The celestial trembled. "Who the hell are you?" he could not help but utter, before he quickly shut his mouth. His stupid curiosity was what got him in this situation, so it was best to keep it suppressed lest he land himself in more trouble. The unusual auras he had felt on Lex's body earlier had let him know that Lex's background was absolutely not simple. When he learned of the Midnight Inn, he more or less confirmed that Lex had some connection to that entity. But even being a janitor counted as being a part of the organization, which would allow Lex to come in contact with those various auras. But, regardless, he did not want to leave any chance for someone to create any trouble for him, so he offered to remove the inscription on his own. But now it seemed like Lex's connection to the Midnight Inn was not as simple as a normal member. Or else, why would there be a hidden guardian inside Lex's body? Due to his unfamiliarity with the lotus on Lex's back, simply due to how incredibly rare it was, the Celestial had misunderstood the situation. He thought the simple thanks from the lotus was a subtle warning for him not to try anything, not that he had any intention to do so from the beginning. The immortal became extremely serious, and decided to complete the removal as quickly as possible without endangering Lex. The lotus, who was suddenly being fed even more energy, became even more ecstatic. This was a rare delicacy. Of course, the lotus also knew how to share, so he used some of that energy to begin healing Lex's body as well, slowly regrowing his skin. The procedure, despite its complexity, did not last long. A few hours later, once he was done, the heir's father teleported away, no longer willing to be involved with Lex. Maintaining his neutrality was becoming a real hassle these days. Chapter 820. What next? Before he felt anything else, Lex heard himself groan. Slowly, sensation returned to him and he felt that his entire body was incredibly stiff. At the same time, he felt incredibly bloated, as if he had been eating nonstop for days. He groaned again as he slowly brought his hands to wipe the sand from his eyes. What the hell happened, he managed to mumble as he opened his eyes, and discovered that his vision was blurry. He was disoriented, nauseous, and his neck was killing him. It felt like he was back in college. Unfortunately, he got no reply to his question, so he could only hold on while his body recovered. Fortunately, his debilitated state did not last long. In a few minutes, his vision cleared up and all his ailments seemed to fade. He slapped his hand onto the floor to pick himself up, and to his great surprise, he noticed a very pale and extremely see-through layer of skin covering it. "Mary, how long have I been out of it?" he asked, his gaze fixed on his hand. Normally, it would take him weeks to recover so much. "A few hours at most," she responded, to his delight. Lightsville, he looked around and saw that he was still inside the formation, though the immortal was gone. All his clothes and items were on the side, neatly folded and untouched. He picked himself up and put on his clothes, flexing his arms and legs as he did. The more he moved, the quicker he recovered, though the unusual bloated feeling was not disappearing. "Thank you, Senior," Lex said out loud, and bowed. Although the immortal was not there, Lex was sure that all his actions were under the immortal's supervision. If he wanted to meet Lex, he would have. Since he had not come, then that was a form of farewell. After waiting a moment to make sure that the immortal was not responding, Lex turned around and left. Outside, an attendant was waiting for him to guide him outside the palace. Although it was quite thoughtful, the attendant's eager attitude to lead Lex outside almost made him suspect that they wanted him gone. But how was that possible? They had quite a good relationship. Lex actually counted the celestial immortal amongst the list of his personal contacts, though admittedly, he did not know his name yet. Whatever the case, Lex had his own tasks to complete, so he did not delay either. Once he left the palace, Lex made his way into the capital city and rented a room in a hotel for a day. Once inside, he finally checked the card that was given to him by Hicks. Unfortunately, there was no indication of any progress in searching for Barley. Lex frowned and considered if he should consult one of the oracles inside the inn. After all, he only had a few weeks left till the inn was sealed. Afterwards, even he would be trapped outside if he remained out, so he had to conclude all his business by then. But the problem with that was the destiny-level protection around the inn. It would prevent divination for anyone inside the inn. Based on that logic, it should also prevent anyone inside the inn from divining anything outside, right? According to the scale he knew, if someone wanted to break through the divine level formation, then their divination would have to be of the death level, which was the level after destiny. Lex did not understand what this scale was based on, but he at least knew the names of the levels. Shaking his head, Lex teleported back to the inn. He had no way of knowing if his inscription was really removed or not, but he trusted that it had been done. Once back at the inn, the first thing Lex did was check his own status to see why he was feeling bloated. Condition: due to extremely high-level spiritual energy passing through them, your meridians are swollen. They will recover on their own within 24 hours. Remarks: you're so used to being pitiful, good things make you sick. Extremely pure energy. Considering his physical condition, Lex decided not to cultivate for the next few days to let his body recover. Although the system said he'd be fine in a day, he didn't want to risk it. Besides, Vera's event was coming up. He could spend the next few days watching over that. He could also try out Kenta's cooking as Leo. More and more ideas kept coming to him for how he could prolong his rest from his cultivation sessions. This was the kind of creativity that usually only hits someone when they're trying to study for exams, but their brain keeps thinking of various fun tasks to do. Teleporting to his office, Lex pulled up all the information about the upcoming event. To be entirely honest, even though Lex wanted to do a lot with it, it was Vera's event, so he could only do what she asked. The event would last 5 days and was not too exciting. Basically, Vera had booked a venue, and all attendees would enter the venue at the beginning of the event, after which it would be sealed. The venue would only open 5 days later. The only actual responsibility Lex had was sealing the venue and doing the advertising once the event was actually over. Of course, there was nothing sinister planned, as all attendees would be informed beforehand that the venue would be sealed. To enter or not was entirely up to them. That was it. So technically, Lex should not have paid such an event any attention at all whatsoever. The problem was, the number of expected participants was massive in the millions. Moreover, all of them were either oracles or diviners, or basically had some profession that dealt with predicting the future. He would feel like he would be missing out on a massive opportunity if he did nothing. The only question was, what could he do?